I think that when you talk about fascism, you have really to extend your mind and to extend the range of your human feelings beyond the ordinary. You know, it has come to a point where we have used that term fascism very loosely, and consequently it loses its cutting edge. But we're talking about something that, in a sense, is monstrous in the 20th century, and certainly that compounds the notion of human exploitation to the nth power and the nth degree. We're talking about a system, really, the weight of which is tremendous. It isn't only a question, you see, of the organizations of working class men and women, organizations which have been put together with such labor and with such sweat and with such difficulty being crushed, although that was done. Fascism did mean the crushing of socialist and communist movements. It did mean the crushing of trade unions put together by working men and women. It isn't only that, nor is it only the fact that capitalism, or big capital, if you please, brushing aside all pretensions at that kind of humanism that 19th century capitalism was supposed to have, that capitalism was perfectly willing to subsidize and to utilize a power force in order to crush working men and women. It isn't even that. That is at the heart, I think, of the exploitation of fascism. Nor is it even the fact that you have systematic violence and systematic terrorism, although that is something that it is difficult, I think, for any of us really to imagine. What it seems to me is at the very heart of the exploitation. What carries it to the nth power is the very fact that fascism was a mass movement, and that people enrolled in it, in the tens of thousands, and finally in the millions, who themselves, if you please, were exploited people. You see what I am talking about. What I am talking about is the failure on the part of working men and women, on the part of those who are fragmented in terms of their workday and fragmented in terms of the very personality that they are able to develop, that those people do not combine and fight on the rational plane in order to change that society, but actually succumb and submit to the very kind of a society that will intensify their misery and intensify their exploitation, and do it because of mystification. Because all of that clear consciousness, after all, that is built in rational movements of working men and women, that all of that begins to disappear, all of that begins to disintegrate. And you have people by the masses, people literally by the millions, who themselves cannot break out of an authority pattern, who feel that guilt, after all, about their own sense of revolt, who in the final analysis submit to another kind of an authority, a most irrational kind of authority, whether it be the leader, whether it be the party, whether it be nation and nationalism, whether it be imperialism, whether it be racial superiority, all of those kinds of authoritarian myths which mystified and finally really exploited in the ultimate way the working class people who were the victims of that system. And it was within that framework of thinking that I read a book last night that raises a kind of a thought, or an avenue of expression, that really I want to bring to you because I think it is important. It's a book that does not deal with fascism. In fact, it deals with a totally other question, and one that I will raise with you at another time. It's written by an Italian woman named Antonietta Macciotti. And Antonietta Macciotti is an Italian communist. And for a number of years, she was a very brilliant writer in Paris for the Italian communist newspaper Unità. And she went in May of 1968 back to Italy in order to stand as a deputy candidate for the Communist Party in Naples and the surrounding area of Naples. And she went back after a number of years and engaged in this election campaign. And during that 70-day period of her election campaign, she had the magnificent idea, being a very sensitive woman, to write very long letters to an extremely brilliant intellectual in France named Louis Althusser, who himself was a Marxist philosopher of the highest order. And consequently, that correspondence of Macciotti to Althusser first was published in the Italian communist magazine Rinascita, and now has been compiled in a book. And you have there 400 pages of thinking of a communist woman, a very sensitive person and a revolutionary devotedly so, who goes through this election campaign. And primarily what Macciotti says has to do really with the strategy and the modalities of trying to bring a revolution in Italy, and is very critical of the Italian Communist Party, and goes down into this area of Naples and criticizes the party in terms that I will raise with you later, but in brief, she says, after all, that we go through these elections when the people know that elections are terribly corrupt here and that they don't really change very much. And furthermore, we have this strategy in the Italian Communist Party of wanting to ally with the Socialist Party, which has long since given up any pretension, after all, of revolution. What Mattioli comes to is what Gramsci came to, after all, in 1920, at the time of the occupation of the factories. What she accuses her party of, on the basis of her experience, is being behind the mask, that it is so bureaucratic, after all, and running by such a sectarian kind of strategy, that it doesn't realize how much revolt there is in the mass, how many people escape the net of the official party itself, that ought to be guided, ought to be organized, ought to be given head, actually, in a movement that will finally change the structure of society. And so what she finally says is, look, down here what I find are all kinds of people, masses, who are not in the Italian Communist Party, who are in revolt. They are the young, they are students, they are those people who you scorn so much, the working proletariat. In other words, those people who are not really organized workers, who do not work every day at a specific job, who, after all, insist upon a certain area of freedom, insist upon living almost a half-bohemian life because they refuse to be integrated within that particular structure. And those people, she said, are very much full of revolt. And what she then proceeds to do in a letter of the 10th of May to Althusser is to cite an anecdote that was told to her by a very wise young working man in Naples, on which she draws a certain kind of conclusion. And the story runs something like this: that one day, on the beaches at Santa Lucia, near Naples, there was a capitalist passing by, a prosperous Italian who was passing by near the beaches. And he saw lying in the sun, in midday, lying in the sun, a young working class boy. And that working class boy lying naked in the sun on his back, sleeping, and he looked at this boy. He simply couldn't stand it, and he said, now look, after all, you should have a job, and you should have a regular wage, and that will give you real dignity. And the boy looked at him and he said, and after? And then the capitalist went on and he said, well, then you can get married, and then you can find an apartment, and you have a systematic life. And the boy looked at him and he said, and after? And he said, well, quite obviously, then you begin raising a family, or you find a better job, you begin making savings. And the boy said, and after? And he said, and then you see, you nurse this income, and then perhaps you get your own business. Or you begin to invest in your own business, and it begins to grow, and you put aside some money for security, and then you get a bigger house. And the boy looked at him and said, and after? And he said, well, at that point, you see, you have then lots of money to educate your children well, you get a large house, you have servants, you can travel. And the boy said, and after? And the man said, well, then you are so well heeled and so rich that you don't have to work at all, and you can simply vacation all the time. And fundamentally, there is in that kind of revolt, a revolt against a certain kind of bourgeois morality, a revolt against a certain kind of structure of society that really bifurcates the personality, that does what Lewis Mumford once called creating organic infelicity, that makes the organism force itself into a pattern or a way of life that really doesn't please it. And as I read that, it seemed to me that there is, in that, if you think about fascism, something that is a remarkable defense against fascism. That ultimately speaking, there is, after all, in that kind of removal or withdrawal from organized structures, a refusal to believe that the organism's revolt must take the form, after all, of fascist aggression or something of that kind. That the revolt begins to take life-giving form. Now, ultimately, if you turn the pendant over and look at the other side of the coin of what Machiavelli is talking about, if you look at the analysis of fascism that was made almost 40 years ago by Wilhelm Reich, and Reich is an extremely brilliant character, after all, somebody who did try to combine Marx and Freud into some kind of a synthesis, and who wrote in the early 30s a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is now reprinted again in an English language edition. And Wilhelm Reich's point is rather simply told, and it is this, that after all, at the very base of human misery, at the very base of human revolt, is alienated labor. It is, after all, a Marxist insight that he is making, but also a Freudian insight, because alienated labor, in Reich's terms, means not only the fact that the product, after all, that is produced by a man is taken away from him, and that he has no control over that most creative part of his day, the day when he is waking, the day when he is working, and consequently, that all of that is taken from him. But it is also a fragmentation of his whole being. It is what Reich calls a destruction of his sex economy, a destruction of the libido, a destruction, after all of those impulses that a man has, or a woman, that have to express themselves. And consequently, you have to have this imposition of a puritanical code, an imposition of a work ethic, in order to force people into this particular mold. Now, says Reich, ultimately, men and women come to a point of revolt. But if they are so pulverized and so conditioned that all of their lives they are full of guilt, if they do not work that routine, if they are full of that sense that authorities will punish them, then ultimately when they make their revolt and they do not have a revolution, they do not have, after all, an alternative way of life, that what they do when they make their revolt, when they must get rid of their aggressions, is to make their revolt channelized toward other authorities, the authorities that fascism provided for them. As Reich put it, fascist mentality is the mentality of the little man who is enslaved and craves authority, and is at the same time rebellious. It is no coincidence that all fascist dictators stem from the reactionary milieu of the little man. The industrial magnate and the feudal militarist exploit this social fact for their own purposes after it has evolved within the framework of the general suppression of life impulses. In the form of fascism, mechanistic authoritarian civilization reaps from the suppressed little man only what it has sown in the masses of subjugated human beings in the way of mysticism, militarism, automatism over the centuries. And consequently, you think of that, and you think really of what a spent there now is in the third quarter of the 20th century, precisely in all of this willingness to withdraw precisely from that kind of restrictive, authoritarian, imposed pattern of activity, which, after all, those people in the early days of fascism did not ultimately pose as an alternative. And so in Italy, for example, in the period before 1922, literally the saddest scene that you have are unemployed Italians, or poor white-collar workers, or ex-soldiers who have no particular place in society, finally, with no other alternative in terms of expressing their revolt, making their way into the fascist region. And that fascism in Italy, if you look at it chronologically, really triumphed between the summer of 1920 and the March on Rome in October of 1922. And if you take the summer of 1920 as your chronological beginning point, it is because in July and August of that particular year, the occupation of the factories by the workers in Piedmont, by the workers in other cities outside of Turin, actually failed. And that failure of the occupation of the factories is crucial in two ways. First of all, because the occupation itself frightened big capital in Italy to the point that it realized that the liberal state could no longer defend it, and consequently that it had to make its terms with a kind of set of condottieri who would, through violence and force, protect its system. And in the second place, because that failure indicated that the Socialist Party at that time, that Italian Socialist Party could not do what Gramsci insisted had to be done, which is to give the masses head, in other words, to enable them to move from that very creative action of occupying the factories into a very revolutionary movement, that Socialist Party was incapable of doing that, incapable on the one hand because it was too reformist in its tradition, and on the other hand because it was too deterministic in its ideology. That it believed, after all, that revolution would come as though by a spontaneous or as though by an automatic signal in the course of time, and that no preparation was necessary. From that point on, fascism becomes important. They have been little squadrons, little groups, after all, of armed men on the street. But what happens after the occupation of the factories is several-fold. First of all, that money begins to flow into the coffers of the fascists, so that they can roll down not only volunteers, but they actually can pay mercenaries to join their squadrons. Secondly, that from the state itself, and that is terribly important because there is terrific complicity. Better Hitler than Blum, as they used to say in France. In other words, the idea that ultimately there is a greater danger than fascism and that it is a socialist revolution, so that the liberal state becomes an accomplice state. And you find it, for example, in many ways. In the courts that do not mete out sentences to the fascists when they break up socialist meetings or when they burn socialist offices. And it is that martyr of fascism himself, Giacomo Matteotti, who was to say in 1924 that the Italian courts have meted out centuries of punishment to the socialists and centuries of absolution to the fascists. And you have it again with the police that look on willingly while the fascist squadrons do their work, and you have it from the governmental level itself. That order that goes out on the 20th of October of 1920 from General Badoglio, who is the Minister of War, and who sent a memo to his commanders saying, when you release officers from the army, tell these ex-officers that they are to go into the fascist squadron, that they will defend, after all, the virtues of Italy in that way. And consequently, you get accomplices for Mussolini's fascists, and they proceed from the late 1920 on a course of systematic violence. If you want a starting point of that, it is that action in Bologna on the 21st of November of 1920. In Bologna of that day, a socialist mayor was to be installed in the city hall. And during that ceremony, the fascists broke up the meeting with a great violence that left finally 10 dead and 100 wounded, and from that point on they proceeded. And you must think in your mind how terrorizing it was for these squadrons, for these bands to move around into city after city. In the next 2 months after the Bologna event, there were the breakings up of some 400 socialist bureaus or socialist offices. There was the breaking up of cooperative and trade union offices. There was ultimately such threat placed that 68 municipal councils resigned in the face of fascist threat. All of which means that fascism by 1921 really becomes a force. That force is manifest in May of 1921 at the elections. Those are the second post-war elections. Now, in the first post-war elections in November of 1919, you had really a socialist victory. And the fascists, even though they had put up some candidates here and there, had not elected a single candidate in November of 1919. Mussolini himself had stood for parliament in Milan in 1919 and had been defeated. He had Marinetti stand, who had been defeated. He had Arturo Toscanini stand, who had been defeated. And consequently, there had been in 1919 no success for the fascists. By 1921, it was different because now the fascists, throwing over any traces of a left-wing ideology, really moving openly to the right, joined the so-called national bloc. In other words, a bloc of very conservative, either Catholic or capitalist parties, and consequently stood the elections and won 35 seats, including Mussolini winning his seat from Milan. Now, 35 isn't very much, But you must remember that fascism isn't even a political party at that time. It's just a group of fasci, or a group of squadri that are moving around, and even then, it has enough so that it elects 25 men. Add to that something very important in 1921, which really is at the heart of socialist weakness, and that is that the fascists installed themselves in the countryside. In other words, began to penetrate the peasantry in two very significant ways. Now, this is important considering how large a sector the rural sector is in Italy. And it is important from the point of view that the socialists missed the boat with the peasants. They never had a peasant program that wasn't really very sectarian, in other words, collectivization of the land. Now, that didn't mean anything to most of the Italian peasants, 60% of whom have no land and want a bit of land. The rest of whom are either sharecroppers or are simply very, very poor landowners and consequently want more land. And there was no real appeal to the peasantry. What happened was that the landless peasants, the agricultural workers, did really a heroic thing in the period after the First World War. They organized really by themselves. And you can't imagine anybody, presumably, with less capacity to organize than they. And so you get these really benighted and poverty-stricken landless workers organizing the Federation of Land Workers, which by July of 1920 had about 800,000 members. And they formed these leagues of landless workers who actually forced bargaining with large landowners so that they got somewhat better wages, so that they got some kind of guarantee of more work, because most of them didn't work half the year, and consequently began to force the landowners into agreements by strike action and so forth. Now, the landowners were frightened and formed a federation of landowners by November of 1920, and then really subsidized the fascists. Just as the industrialists subsidized the fascists, so did the great proprietors. And the fascists provided two solutions for them. First of all, terror, which meant that the squadri would move into the villages, and if there was a peasant or an agricultural worker who was peculiarly subversive, they simply terrorized him. But secondly, the fascists organized their own rural syndicates, or their own rural unions, in which they did promise land, in which they did appeal demagogically and say that they would give land, and consequently organized a lot of the landless into these fascist unions, which they then used as strikebreakers actually in the cities. And consequently, the fascists managed to do something in 1921, which would be crucial in 22, namely, they neutralized the countryside. And consequently, when the fascists moved, there would be no opposition, really, from the rural areas. And finally, in 1921, the fascists organized a party. And this they did at the Congress of Rome in November of 1921. And Mussolini's idea was that the squadri, or the fasci, had to move to a political plane in order to become a mass organization. In November of 1921, there were 2,200 fasci enrolling about 320,000 men. But they needed more, they needed a mass, and they needed, you see, an instrument to take power. You cannot give power just to paramilitary groups. You give power to a political movement. And consequently, it was time to organize the National Fascist Party, which was organized at the Congress of Rome in 1921. And the ideology of that fascist party was stated very bluntly by Mussolini when he said that we are liberals in economics, but not in politics. And what Mussolini meant was that there would be no socialism after all in this fascism, that had been washed out and drained away, but that there would be force in order to maintain order, in order to maintain a systematic society. And consequently, some weeks after that fascist party was founded, on the 27th of December of 1921, came a proclamation from this fascist national party saying that the state was after all at stake. And if the liberal government could not keep order, the fascists would simply take power. It was a threat, after all, either maintain order, in other words, put down the working class movement once and for all, or we will take order, we will take power, and with that came the organization of a fascist army. In other words, really organizing these squadrons into a very systematic, regular army headed by a Carabalbo, and consequently, you really get a political party with an armed force simply attached to it. Now, all this time, in 1921, what was the response of the left? The response of the left by 1921 was really very feeble. You had a certain strength still. And this, of course, is the maddening thing about Italian fascism. When you stop to think, after all, that in 1924, 2 years after Mussolini took power, when there were elections in 1924 in April of that year, that with all of the fascist terrorism and with all of the fascists in power, that the fascists got 4,200,000 votes and the opposition parties 3 million votes, you see that there really is opposition. Well, that opposition was there in 1921. In the elections of that year, if the socialists and communists were now divided, which they had not been in the elections of 1919, and if they lost some seats, they went down from the 156 seats that the socialists had gained in 1919 to a combined 138 seats, 122 for the socialists, 16 for the communists. And consequently, it isn't so great a loss. In actual total of votes, they gained 25,000 more votes. Add to that the fact that in 1921, in competition with these fascist squadrons, you get the organization of what are called Partito del Popolo. In other words, a people's militia, organized by the communists especially, in order to fight violence with violence, in order really to organize the working class, which is being struck down, and consequently to confront it on the streets. All of that you have in 1921, but you have no strategy really of defense. You have the socialists, after all, in 1921, still meeting at their Congress, as they did in October of that year, and declaring that fascism, after all, is simply the last groaning, the last death pangs of capitalism, and consequently the system is doomed to fall. In other words, you still have attentisme. You still have just wait until the system falls without any proper strategy being offered for it. With the communists might have projected something very interesting in 1921, because there were directives from Moscow, which for once were very intelligent directives so far as Italy was concerned. Because the whole Third Congress in July of 1921, the Third Royal Congress of the Comintern, had projected, as I have told you, this idea of the Pontiac, this idea of the United Front. And the idea was that even after there had been schism, so that reformists had been locked off, those parties that belonged to the Third International, that it was important to win over the masses that still escaped the net of communism and that belonged to the Socialist Party. In other words, the directive went out really to make a unity at the base. It tried to make unity between communist and socialist workers. All of which was terribly important and intelligent for Italy. You could not afford to have that kind of schism in the face of something that really was horrendous. And yet, the Italian communists proved to be ultra-sectarian. And so Bordiga, who surely was the leading theoretician at this time of the Italian Communist Party, put forth what were called the Rome Theses. The Rome Theses, called that way after the Communist Party Congress of Rome of March of 1922, which rejected the idea of the United Front and which said that you could not make any kind of truck with the socialists at all. You could not even try to win over their particular workers, and consequently there was no effort, any more than there was any effort between communists and social democrats in Germany in 1928 to 1932, no real effort to ward off fascism with some kind of a unity of that kind. All of which means that the year 1922 will be the crucial year. And in 1922, the fascists really run amok in Italy. And what they do, I think, is terribly important in terms of our understanding of this whole movement. First of all, they begin to plant certain institutions in Italy by 1922. In January of that year is founded the Federation of Fascist Syndicates. Now, the Federation of Fascist Syndicates is a big phony. That is to say, it passes as a trade union movement formed and organized by the Fascist Party. Basically, it did enroll about 800,000 by the time you come down to July of 1922, and that is bad from the point of view of winning over certain workers from the CGL, from the General Confederation of Labor. But you see what the real problem of this Federation of Fascist Syndicates is. It is headed by that old anarcho-syndicalist, Edmondo Rossani. And Rossani, you see, was a trade union guard, had been a revolutionary syndicalist, but had rather given up, was one of those left interventionists from syndicalism during the war. Now, Rossani heads this fascist federation of syndicates, and his idea really is that through a certain class collaboration, through a certain enforced collaboration, you can really resolve a lot of the questions of working people. There is, maddeningly enough, a sincerity about a man like Rossani. And consequently, these fascist syndicates represent what is the so-called ideological and strategic base of fascism, namely corporatism. The idea is to enroll both employers and workers in the same syndicate, to enroll both landowners and landless workers in the same agricultural syndicate. In other words, to work out a very real class collaboration with presumably the neutral intervention of the state in order to make a proper adjudication. If a Rossani is sincere about this, it is because he has given up on the idea of the class struggle, and because he really believes that the fascist movement will serve as a kind of neutral arbiter between capital and labor. Mussolini prided himself on his notion of corporatism. For 20 years, he kept bleating about the fact that he had solved the contradiction between capitalism and socialism, and he had done it by forcing both capital and labor to mute their particular interests and subordinate them to the higher interest of the state. In reality, what they muted their interest to was the higher interest of capital, as it turned out in the kinds of bargaining these syndicates worked out. But you have here in corporatism something that is mystification at the very heart of that concept. It is mystification, the idea that you will resolve the problem of struggle by giving up the struggle, and saying fundamentally that you will be able to make this bargaining. What is the mystification? It is that men, after all, can have a decent life without ever moving out of their particular status, without ever moving out of the position or the particular relationship to the marketplace or to the productive system that the worker status has imposed upon them. And so you begin to get the planting of a kind of fascist mystery, a fascist mystification through an institution of that kind. And then force. 1922 is really the year of force. It's the year when the fascists begin to move almost perpetually. By March of 1922, there are black shirts by the 30 and 40,000 of them, marching through streets like Milan and streets like the streets of cities like Milan and like Bologna. But the touch point, the point that really touches off the whole drive, comes in May. In May, you have a general strike, and it's the traditional general strike of the 1st of May. And Mussolini attacks it, and consequently decides that against that general strike of the 1st of May, the fascists must begin really to demystify socialism and to destroy it. And so meetings are broken up on the 1st of May, and there follows a month-long kind of marathon in Italy, which culminates in the very last days of May, again in the city of Bologna, a tremendous fascist invasion of that city, which forces the government to change actually the municipal administration of Bologna and even the prefect who dominated in that area. By the time the summer of 1922 comes around, Mussolini thinks that his only problem is whether to make a coup de force. In other words, to take power by force or simply to wait to be called to power. And it is the waiting game for this particular moment or for this period of time that he plays. In the meantime, the economy favors the fascists, because the economy all this time really continues to deteriorate. The inflation keeps going up, the depreciation of the currency really goes on apace, and all of the time, big capital is in trouble. It is in trouble because there are no markets, the markets really decline, and it is becoming impatient to the point of very decisive action. Resistance, one last action, one last mode of resistance, and then it was over. And that last act of resistance, the 1st of August of 1922. And it was a strike. And it was a general strike called by the Free Anti-Fascist Labor Federation, the so-called Labor Alliance. And they called a general strike for the 1st of August. And it was supposed to be very secret. That is the calling of this strike, so that there should be an element of surprise, and that the workers really should paralyze the economy, at least for a day, and perhaps for more. And the goal to force the government to restore order to the streets. In other words, to clean up these fascist squadrons, and perhaps even more than that, perhaps even really to make this revolutionary movement once more a reality. All of that was left open-ended with this last desperate strike of August of 1922. And the surprise was not there, because a labor newspaper in Genoa, Il Lavoro, spilled it, and consequently on the 29th of July published the plans for this general strike, and consequently the fascists were ready. And the fascist party declared openly that if the government could not suppress this strike, it would, and consequently the strike became a contestation between the traditional working class movement built over so long a period of time and these fascist squadrons. The result was a failure for the strike. In a few cities, there was a good turnout. In most cities, a mediocre turnout, and none in the small towns. The fascists, however, really were on the move. They moved so far and so fast that they destroyed socialist newspapers, socialist press, socialist offices, and made August of 1922 really their turning point. From that point on, until the March on Rome on the 30th of October of 1922, there are only two counter-currents: a disaggregation of the left and a picking up of allies by the fascists. By the time you come to the fall of 1922, people are getting on the bandwagon. The fascists have no problem with the police and the army. They have no problem with big capital. They don't even have any problem with the Vatican. The Vatican had a new pope at that time, a man named Achille Ratti, and he had been the archbishop at the Cardinal at Milan. And before he became Pope in February of 1922 as Pope Pius XI, he had already blessed fascist banners inside his cathedral, so that he was reasonably sympathetic. And consequently, from the Vatican, there was no opposition. There was scarce opposition even from members of the ministry, but the question was the king. And the king, after all, Victor Emmanuel III, hardly a front runner in the history of courage, but fundamentally, who still had the idea of preserving the monarchy, and Mussolini had always claimed to be a Republican and wanted to destroy the monarchy. What all became necessary was a certain kind of accommodation to that monarchy, so that Mussolini should be brought to power with a certain myth of legalism. And consequently, Mussolini made his famous speech of the 21st of September of 1922, in which he bluntly said, what we fascists most want is to get to power. And consequently, the idea of changing a position from Republican to monarchist is not such a serious thing. In addition to which, as we think about it and as we reflect about it, the king does sum up the national tradition. And consequently, Mussolini made his accommodation, and it was unlikely that the king would oppose October of 1922. And the 24th of October of 1922, the fascists met in an exultant convention in Naples. And Mussolini screamed to that exultant convention, and he said, taking power now is only a matter of days, at most a matter of weeks. Whether we do it by force or whether we are called, all remains, after all, to be seen. And that very night, the night of the 24th of October, meeting in the Hotel Vesuvio in Naples, he and his high command charted and rising. A rising scheduled for the 27th of October, which would be followed by a march on Rome on the 28th of October. And he went back that very night to Milan to prepare for this coup. The Prime Minister at that time was not, again, a very strong man. Luigi Facta, simply an old politician of the Giolitti school who had done nothing to oppose Mussolini, nothing to oppose fascism, and it is only when fascism really was a reality, was shot through the entire society, that Facta suddenly became worried. And consequently, on the 27th of October, as this fascist rising, demonstrations in various cities began to take place, Luigi Facta ran to the king. And he said, we must declare martial law. And the king said he would think about it, and Facta went away, and the entire ministry resigned. And Facta suddenly was head of a caretaker government, not really even with a constitutional power. All of that day, the 27th of October, there are fascist invasions of cities, most cities of which have authorities that simply let them in. By the 28th of October, it looks as though the insurrection is successful, and Facta himself declares martial law. He declares martial law on the morning of the 28th of October. And a kind of a remarkable thing happened. When he declared martial law and said that an illegal insurrection was taking place, he actually was able to call out certain loyal army commanders. And in the city of Rome, for example, he called out a General Pugliese at the head of 25,000 troops that occupied the bridges over the Tiber and that surrounded the main buildings of the city of Rome, even while the fascists were racing around in the streets, but indicated that the city of Rome could be defended. But what he needed, you see, for that particular order of martial law was the agreement of the king. And he went at 9 o'clock that night to see the king, and he asked him to sign this order for martial law. The king refused. It is at that point that the king will bring Mussolini to power. By 11:30 that night, the martial law edict is withdrawn, and consequently, the fascists are left without opposition. The next day, the 29th of October, goes a telegram to Milan from the king to Mussolini, asking him to come to Rome, his march on Rome, to come to Rome in order to accept office, and on the 30th of October, not marching, but coming in a first-class train, coming down from Milan to Rome, arriving at the central station of Rome at 10:30 in the morning, Mussolini on the 30th of October accepts the offer of the king, forced, after all, by the kind of violence that had been organized in that month of October. What did it mean? Its meaning should be very clear, which is that for a long period of time, working men and women had built organizations, and within a flash, those organizations were destroyed. But Italian fascism meant, like German fascism later, or fascism almost everywhere, is that the independency of a working class, the independency of men and women who want either to bargain or to struggle or to strive, that must be destroyed, and in fact, their consciousness must be completely pulverized by the mythology of the system. It went something like this in Italy. In 1923, in December, there was an agreement known as the Chigi Agreement, the Palazzo Chigi Agreement, which was an agreement between the Federation of Fascist Unions and the Federation of Industrialists, in which the industrialists agreed to recognize only the fascist unions in bargaining. In other words, that corporatist system would be imposed. And yet, the General Confederation of Labor, that old labor organization, which working men and women had legitimately built, that General Confederation of Labor didn't lose a great number of its members. It continued to go on until, in 1926,
Mussolini's fascism dissolved the General Confederation of Labor and, as a matter of fact, prohibited totally the right to strike. The right to strike could be punished, after all, by a year to 3 years in prison for rank and file, by 7 years in prison for those who were called the leaders of those particular strikes. So that you get a corporatism or fascist union alone representing the working class, and even there it was too much. Because, you see, even in that corporate system, a man like Rossoni had been a labor god. And at the head of a lot of the federations in this particular federation of fascist unions or syndicates, there were some bona fide labor people. And consequently, in 1927 and 8, when the industrialists began cutting wages really drastically, to the point that workers could not really live, when their real and money wages were both disintegrating, this actual federation of fascist syndicates, Rossoni, met at Rome in a congress in 1928 and complained about this kind of favoritism to the industrialists. From the heart of this fascist institution, you even get such a complaint, so that Mussolini dissolved this federation of fascist syndicates and actually eliminates Rossoni and eliminates a lot of those bona fide labor men who were still in these syndicates, and from that time there is no representation of the working man at all under fascism. So that you get, in 1934, for example, the imposition of the livre, of the worker's passbook, in which no workers can move around on the street or into a job without a passbook that gives his work record and that indicates that he is not a troublemaker or an agitator. So that in 1935, on the eve of the Ethiopian War, when you have to work in these war plants and so forth, there is an actual military imposition imposed upon factory workers, in which 5 days of leave without permission in a row is considered to be army desertion, punishable by 5 years in prison. So that what you have really is the militarization, the subservience of the working class by the destruction of what had been their autonomous and their indigenous organizations and institutions. If you want to know what fascism is at that level, you can see what it is when men and women participate in a movement and find themselves suddenly totally paralyzed and powerless within the framework of that movement. The beneficiaries, aside from the political ruling class itself, the beneficiaries, big Italian capital, which now had markets that were provided by these gigantic public works programs of Mussolini. The railroads had been running at a deficit because they were underused, because there weren't enough usage for them, and so they built more railroads. There were very few cars at that time. They built a huge road system. And then, of course, the military preparations of the 1930s, which took lira by the billions, all of that provided the kind of impetus or the kind of internal market that Italian capital had sought and Italian capital had wanted. For agrarian personnel, nothing. Agrarian personnel, and you must understand a certain amount of the pathos of this. Agrarian personnel, landless workers, who thought that they would get land, got nothing. There had actually been a squatter movement in the period before 1922, and a law had covered those squatters and said that if they had squatted on unused land, they could stay there. The fascists threw them off the land and returned that land to the original landlords. No. None of that, after all, was a liberation for the mass. And at the top was violence and terror, and it was a violence and terror that maintained a political ruling class in power. And the symbol of it is the murder of Mattiossi. And Mattiossi, after all, is a hero because legalism, in that sense, legalism against that kind of terror was worth defending in 1924. Mattiossi was a reformist socialist. And after the elections of April of 1924, this little, rather thin, rather handsome, youngish Italian socialist deputy, who himself had a lot of money, but who was a very warm-spirited guy, who had been a defeatist in the course of the war, wanted Italy out of that war at any price, a kind of a courageous man. And Mattiossi, after those elections, simply could not stand it. They had been absolutely so terroristic, so fraudulent. And so when the Parliament opened May of 1924, with Mussolini sitting there triumphantly. His fascists had won all kinds of seats in the parliament, 350 now, because of the rigged election, sitting there triumphantly, and Mattioli wouldn't let him, and he stood and he denounced these elections. And he said that they were frauds and demanded that they be cancelled or that the fascists be thrown out. And Mussolini swelled with anger in that session and said nothing while others tried to drown out Mattioli. That's the 30th of May. By the 10th of June, he was assassinated. Assassinated by fascist thugs on the street. And it was at that moment that there might have been a call for a rising, because the anti-fascist deputies then withdrew from the Chamber of Deputies and went to the Aventine Hill, like the old Roman plebeians withdrawing against the patricians to the Aventine. And so the communists, the socialists, the popolari, the liberals all withdrew to the Aventine, and there was the moment to call something. The communists said a general strike, a tax strike, a demand that we are the parliament here on the Aventine. But the socialists said, no, that is too extreme. The popolari would not work with the socialists. And so on the Aventine, they simply dwindled, and Mussolini got over that particular crisis of Mattioli. But you see, it was a moment. And Lenin knew it was a moment. And Lenin was, after all, a very tired and sick man when he went to the Fourth Congress of the Third International in November and December of 1922 for his last appearance. And it was very sad for Lenin to think that, first of all, the new economic policy had been a step backward for Russia, and secondly, that the world revolution hadn't come, and third, he knew that fascism was there. And so he went, this very sick man who had suffered strokes of the kind that you have read about in the Leuven book, and who knew that his days were numbered, and he spoke at that very last time this way. At the Third Congress in 1921, he adopted a resolution on the organizational structure of the Communist parties and on the methods and content of their activities. The resolution is an excellent one, but it is almost entirely Russian. That is to say, everything in it is based upon Russian conditions. This is its good point, but also its failing. It is its failing because I am sure that no foreigner can read it. I have read it again before saying this. In the first place, it is too long. Foreigners are not able to read such long things. Secondly, even if they read it, they will not understand it because it is too Russian. Not because it is written in Russian, it has been excellently translated, but because it is thoroughly imbued with the Russian spirit. And thirdly, if by way of exception some foreigner does understand it, he cannot carry it out because it fits Russian conditions. If we do not realize this, we are unable to move ahead. I think that after 5 years of the Russian Revolution, the most important thing for all of us, Russian and foreign comrades alike, is to sit down and study. We have only now obtained the opportunity to do so. I do not know how long this opportunity will last. I do not know how long the capitalist powers will give us the opportunity to study in peace. But we must take advantage of every moment of respite from fighting, from war, to study, and to study from scratch. The fascists in Italy may render us a great service by showing the Italians that they are not yet sufficiently enlightened and that their country cannot be insured against the Black Hundred. Perhaps this will be very useful. We Russians must also find ways and means of explaining the principles of this resolution to the foreigners. I am sure that in this connection, we must tell not only the Russians, but the foreign comrades as well, that the most important thing in this period we are now entering is to study. I urge you to study.